Well, good afternoon. Let's get started. My name is Melanie Kamen. I'm acting director of the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs, and I'm really delighted to welcome you to this Warren and Anita Manshel lecture in American Foreign Policy, and I'm especially pleased to welcome the members of the Manshel family who are here with us today. It's really an honor to have you with us. So I want to tell you a little bit about the history of this lecture, and then I'll introduce our speaker. Warren and Anita Manshel were an extraordinary couple. Warren played a central role in stimulating informed debate on domestic and foreign policy issues through founding two journals, The Public Interest and then Foreign Policy, which he co-edited for a decade with our former center director, Samuel Huntington. As he so often acknowledged, Anita supported Warren in his many endeavors, which included a 3-year tour as the U.S. ambassador to Denmark. And during this time, Anita pursued a parallel career in the promotion of art and music. Given Warren's deep concern with America's role in the world and his active support of Harvard's Center for International Affairs, his family and friends created this lectureship in 1993 to honor the memory of Warren and Anita. It stands as a memorial to the Manshels' longstanding commitment to advance greater understanding of the international relations of the United States. Manshel lectures have featured most recently last year a talk by Peter Katzenstein, which was entitled Trumpism in American Foreign Policy, and then before that by Robert Cohane on the topic of international institutions in an era of populism, nationalism, and diffusion of power. So you see these lectures are hitting on some of the most important issues of our time, and that's no exception for today's topic. Today's speaker and her topic are a very welcome addition to our desire, in fact, to understand America's role in our rapidly changing world. So it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Kathryn Sikkink. So let me tell you a little bit about our speaker today for those of you that don't know her. I know some of you do, as she's a distinguished professor at the Harvard Kennedy School. She's the Ryan Family Professor of Human Rights Policy at the Kennedy School. And she is the author, she's an author, human rights academic, and scholar of international relations, working primarily through the theoretical lens of constructivism. She received her bachelor's degree in international relations from the University of Minnesota and her MA and PhD in political science and international relations from Columbia University. Sikkink works on international norms and institutions, transnational advocacy networks, the impact of human rights law and policies, and transitional justice. Prior to her career at the Harvard Kennedy School, Sikkink served as the Carol Pforzheimer Professor at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard, and a Regents Professor and the McKnight Presidential Chair in Political Science at the University of Minnesota. She's received many awards. I'm going to name a few of them. In 2008, Sikkink received a Guggenheim Fellowship. In 2012, she won the Robert Kennedy Book Award for her book on international human rights titled The Justice Cascade, which discusses the origins and effects of human rights trials on geopolitics and global justice. There's many other notable publications, so I'm going to name a few. These include Evidence for Hope, Making Human Rights Work in the 21st Century, Mixed Signals, U.S. Human Rights Policy in Latin America, Activists Beyond Borders, Advocacy Networks in International Politics, which was co-authored with Margaret Keck and was awarded the Gravemeyer Award for Ideas for Improving World Order, and the International Studies Association Chadwick Alger Award for Best Book in the area of international organizations. And also, last but not least, The Persistent Power of Human Rights from Commitment to Compliance, which was co-edited with Thomas Risse and Stephen Rapp. Sikkink has also been a Fulbright Scholar in Argentina and a Guggenheim Fellow. She's a member of the American Philosophical Society, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the Council on Foreign Relations, and a member of the board of international organizations. So I could go on, but I think it's clear that we have an extremely distinguished scholar with us here today. And I just want to say a couple of words about why I personally find her work so compelling and so important. I've drawn on it in my own work on non-state social welfare, both international and domestic. And she personally is a great source of inspiration to me. She's a model, in my view, of rigorous scholarship on important issues, and more than that, of engaged scholarship. It's the work of scholars like Sikkink who remind us that our work as researchers can be at once serious from an academic perspective and meaningful for the world that we inhabit and for the communities with which we engage or hope to engage with. That we can both study human rights or transitional justice and try to promote and improve human rights and justice in the world, I think, is a very important thing. Her topic today, as I think is most evident from the title, is extremely important: towards a politics of responsibility, the case of climate change. So please welcome Kathryn Sikkink.
Well, first, thank you, Melody, for that lovely introduction. I'm really honored to have been asked to give the Warren and Anita Manshel lecture. And I guess I can just use the arrows. I don't need a clicker, do I? And I'm particularly pleased to have members of the Manshel family here, David and Sandy here in the audience, so, as well as other friends and colleagues. Now, as you heard, the Manshel lectures are lectures on American foreign policy in the honor of Warren and Anita Manshel. And so for me, this presented a bit of a dilemma, okay? I work on, this is a lecture on American foreign policy, and I work on climate change, or I'm working on climate change, right? And so I wrestled with how to deal with this dilemma, and Melanie and I had a few conversations about it, and I said, you know, I can stand in front of you and tell you what the Trump administration is not doing to mitigate climate change, or is doing to undermine efforts by other actors, okay? But I think most people in this audience know that, and so I wouldn't be telling you anything new. I could decide to do one of those kind of forward-looking situations where I offer a plan for a new U.S. administration that may or may not come into power in January of 2021. But the climate clock is ticking, as you know, and but while we're having this technical issue here, let me tell you another second technical issue, and that is that I hope you can see my PowerPoint well enough. We're trying to keep the lights up well enough because we are filming this event. Okay. So anyway, the climate clock.
So I thought I would start with the image from the poster for my talk, which actually I did not select, but which is that
Should I try to talk over this? Okay, try to talk over. Okay. So the idea here is that the climate clock is ticking. And I don't want to have to wait and give you an agenda for what someone who may be in office in January 2021 might be able to do. And so instead, I'm going to say, what happens when we want a foreign policy that is... I don't think I can do this. Okay.
the system was used to track indentured migrants across the British Empire, so you hold
We're going to...
It's next door. I'm sure it's a fascinating door. It's not the one we want to dig in.
The census numbers follow the migrants to their target indenture. For those who returned to India, their numbers were dutifully recorded alongside a tally of the money they carried with them on their return. For those...
Okay. Okay. Now, so since we're filming this, let's just pretend I'm beginning here. Okay? Let's say. So today I'm going to be speaking about material from my forthcoming book, which is The Hidden Face of Rights Towards a Politics of Responsibility. And I'm very happy because literally the first copy of the book arrived in my office yesterday. So you are the first people ever to see the new book. And this book is based on what were called the Castle Lectures that I gave at Yale now about almost 2 years ago. So the topic of the book is a broader book about how to combine rights and responsibilities. Okay? And climate change is just one of about 5 topics I talked about in that book. But it's a particularly useful case to make the main point of the book, and that is that it's not enough in these days to talk about rights. We have a big gap in implementation with rights. And in order to implement rights more fully, we have to think simultaneously about rights and responsibilities. And that when we think of responsibilities, it's not enough to think just about state responsibilities. Of course with climate change, we want to think about state responsibilities for mitigating climate change. We want to think about corporate responsibilities. But we also want to think about responsibilities of other non-state actors. And in that I include not just corporations who are non-state actors, but also NGOs, also universities, also individuals. Okay. And so some of you who may be familiar with my previous work or listening to Melanie's description of my previous work, you may say, so why is Kathryn Sikkink, who's an IR scholar of human rights, transitional justice, and norm theory, all of a sudden talking about climate change? And it is true that I'm new to this issue. But I'm talking about it for a couple of reasons. One reason is that climate activists themselves are beginning to use human rights as a frame to think about climate. And so, for example, here are the young plaintiffs in a lawsuit in Juliana v. U.S., which is asking the U.S. government to recognize the rights of future generations and step up and do more on climate change. There's a similar case in Colombia that the young plaintiffs have won their case in the Colombian Constitutional Court. And the Constitutional Court is requiring the Colombian government to meet with the young plaintiffs and other communities to form an intergenerational climate pact, and especially around deforestation. Colombia, to meet its Paris Agreement goals, has promised deforestation. And so it focuses on how Colombia can do a better job on that. And so the Greta Thunberg is working with 15 other children to bring a case to the United Nations. Here she's bringing a case to the UN committee that oversees the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the human rights of the child. She's saying that states have violated the human rights of children and the future generations of children by failing to address climate change. But even more, how can I say, even more kind of far-fetched arguments, rights arguments are being made in this area. So there's arguments about the rights of trees. This comes from Christopher Stone's book, but also very well-cited law review article on the rights of trees. People are making arguments about getting rights for rivers. And here, Colorado River was trying to join other rivers of the world, including the Ganges River, which are already recognized as bearers of rights. And perhaps the biggest example is the earth herself is being seen as having rights. So Pachamama is the earth goddess in some Andean indigenous cultures. And in both Ecuador and Bolivia, the constitutions talk about rights of Pachamama. Okay, so it's not so much that I'm moving to climate change, it's that the climate change people have come to my realm, the realm of human rights. But and I am not at all opposed to these rights claims. I'm not opposed to the notion that rivers, trees, or Pachamama herself should have rights. And I'm, in fact, particularly enthusiastic about the idea of thinking about rights of future generations. But it illustrates my broader point in this book, and that is rights only get us so far. And if we do not combine our concern with rights with a robust understanding of responsibilities of states and non-state actors, we will not be able to implement these rights. So the other reason I'm kind of following through on thinking about climate change is that this is my rights and responsibilities framework. The scholars who have been, IR scholars who've dedicated themselves much more to climate change, in this case, Robert Cohane, who spoke here 2 years ago, are starting to write in a way that really leaves a door open for people who do my kind of work. Okay, so here's Cohane and Oppenheimer, and they're saying, you know, climate change is not going to be solved at the level of international negotiations, right? It will depend much on domestic and transnational politics. And I really love this part, the Paris Agreement accomplishes little, but it opens what was a locked door. That door is now a little bit ajar. Pushing hard could carry us through to a better outcome, okay? But nothing will be accomplished at the international negotiation level alone, okay? So the question before us is how the door is open by Paris. How do we push through that door, okay? And I'm going to argue that some of the work that I've done in my whole lifetime on transnational social movements, on norm change, on norm entrepreneurs, on how do you move from having norm entrepreneurs to having social movements that can bring about dramatic change in the world, is now relevant to this climate change area. So in some of the earlier books, and Melanie mentioned Activists Beyond Borders or The Justice Cascade, I studied historical and current norms campaigns. Okay, and I went all the way back. I have a chapter that looks at the anti-slavery movement, looks at women's suffrage. It looks at one of my favorite cases was the issue of ending foot binding in China, for example. And then I look at the ways in which human rights entered into first international relations, international law, and then into American foreign policy. Okay, nowadays, of course, we think human rights is part of foreign policy. Henry Kissinger wrote in 1976, you know, that human rights had no place in foreign policy, okay? So things change, and they change because of the kinds of people that I call norm entrepreneurs. In other words, they change from the bottom up. Usually changes do not happen from the top down. Governments don't offer individuals their rights on a platter. People demand their rights, they organize campaigns, and they bring about change. And so, for example, in the case of the anti-slavery activists that I looked at, it was anti-slavery activists, originally Quakers, tiny groups of Quakers, right, who first put forward this idea, what a crazy idea at the time, that slavery was social sin and must be ended. Eventually, they were able to elect members to the U.S. Parliament, to the UK Parliament and to the U.S. Congress, okay? And those, I don't know if anyone's seen the book, the movie Amazing Grace, but tells the story of Wilbur Wilberforce, who was one of the abolitionists elected to the Parliament, the UK Parliament. They called them the Saints. There weren't very many of them, but they were the swing votes in the U.S. Parliament, in the UK Parliament. And they were the ones who insisted on abolition as part of the price of their membership in the coalition. And that's what led the British to push for abolition of slavery. Okay? And so these social movements do not have to become, majoritarian movements, but they learn how to wield some power to bring about change. So the thing that happens with these norm entrepreneurs is they take ideas that at the time, when you go back and study the history, at the time were unimaginable. And they turn them into things that are eventually taken for granted. And sometimes that takes centuries. Okay. And sometimes it moves a lot faster than that. So for example, in my book, The Justice Cascade here, I studied this new trend of how you move from it being unimaginable to hold state officials criminally accountable for mass atrocity. Up until, except for Nuremberg and Tokyo trials, okay, up until about 1973, it was unimaginable that state officials would be held accountable for human rights violations committed during their terms, okay? And yet now, today, we have an international criminal court capable and in the process of prosecuting officials, state officials for mass atrocity. And I'm actually very pleased to have in the room my friend and colleague, the founding prosecutor of the ICC, Luis Moreno Ocampo. So my point here is we need norm entrepreneurs, and guess what? We've got them, okay? The young people are stepping forward to be the norm entrepreneurs, okay? This is a photo I took at the climate march, the climate strike in Boston. You know, they're skipping their lessons to teach us one. Well, the lesson, so we've got the norm entrepreneurs, but now we have to figure out how are we going to take responsibility to begin to support, sustain, disagree, but generally be part of this coalition that these norm entrepreneurs are trying to form. And so to think about responsibility then sent me back to realize, what do we mean? What do we really mean by responsibility? It's one of those ordinary words we use a lot. But when I started to use it in casual conversation, I started to get a lot of pushback. People don't like the word responsibility. And they really don't like the word duty, which is how we used to talk about it, and obligations. Okay? And so I started to feel like there was something interesting, because when I brought up responsibility, and especially non-state responsibility, I started to get a lot of pushback. And one reason why climate change is a good case is that people are willing to stay with me longer when I start talking about responsibility. Now, I drew on, in thinking about responsibility, I drew very much on political theorist Iris Marion Young. This is her beautiful posthumous book called Responsibility for Justice. And Young makes an argument that I think helps us understand why people don't like responsibility. Because mainly when we say responsibility, we mean what Young calls the liability model. We mean who's to blame, who can we sue, who can we punish. And that's what she calls backward-looking responsibility. And the main model we have of responsibility in the world is actually a backward-looking blame model. And this is partly driven by lawyers, okay? So lawyers, you know, that's their job, blaming people, finding out who to sue and who to punish. But it means that sometimes we are too backward-looking. Now, as you gathered from my previous slide, I'm in favor of punishment for some rights issues. Okay? I believed that state leaders deserved to be held criminally responsible for mass atrocity. But for most human rights issues, and also for climate change, punishment doesn't get you very far. You need to have forward-looking responsibility. Instead of saying who's to blame, you need to say also, what can we do? What can we do together in order to bring about change as we move forward? And that's how Young helped me. She has this, what she calls a social connection model of responsibility. So instead of being backward-looking, it's forward-looking, and it says all the actors who are socially connected to a structural injustice and able to act must take action, okay? And I think that we've reached the point with climate change where that's exactly correct. All the actors socially connected to the structural injustice of climate change and able to act need to step forward, take responsibility, and act together. Now, first I have to say, and to the lawyers present, that I'm not talking about legal responsibility here. This forward-looking responsibility is not legal responsibility. I'm not talking about writing a new treaty for legal responsibility. I'm talking about ethical and political responsibility. And so if it's ethical and political, then the question that Young asks us is, how do we reason about it? How do we reason about forward-looking ethical and political responsibility? And Young gives us what she calls 4 parameters. Parameters to reason about one's own actions and those of others. And those 4 parameters are power, privilege, collective ability, and interest. And I'm going to focus today on power and privilege. And the reason I'm doing that is because we know from the data on emissions, and especially on these are what so-called lifestyle consumption emissions, that about 10% of the world's wealthiest people produce 49, almost 50% of global lifestyle emissions. Okay, and that the poorest 50% are only responsible for 10% of total lifestyle emissions. So it means it's really important to think about power and privilege. But as soon as I say 10%, most of us in the room, and this would be myself included initially, I said, oh yeah, those wealthy 10% out there, those people who travel by plane every day to London or whatever. And then I started gathering the data. Who are the 10% most wealthy people in the world? And it turns out there's from 2 different sources. I'm sure there's debate. Something between $68,000 and $100,000 in assets puts you in the 10% wealthiest people in the world. Okay, so to my, so I can say, with regard to my colleagues at the Kennedy School, for example, that my faculty colleagues and I are in the 10% wealthiest people in the world. I'm not going to make any generalizations about the audience, right? But my colleagues and I at the Kennedy School are there. And what that means is we can't keep saying, oh, the responsibility is those wealthy 10% out there. We have to say, no, we need, if we're concerned about people with power and privilege taking action, that needs to include us, me and my colleagues at the Kennedy School. Okay, so this idea, though, of responsibility is starting to catch on. This is a survey that was done in August this year, 2019. It's not a huge survey. It's only a little over 1,000 people, so it's only suggestive, right? But it suggests that U.S. citizens are beginning to think about responsibility in more diverse ways, okay? So that while, of course, they are most concerned, and correctly so, about responsibility of corporations, U.S. federal government, and developed or industrialized countries outside of the U.S., they recognize that individual people, as well as as well as your local government officials, so people in cities, local people in cities, are people who also have a great deal or some responsibility. So 79% of people in this survey think that individuals have a great deal of or some responsibility for climate change. Now I'm going to move us to talk about about Harvard. Okay, so sometimes I think talking responsibility is good to start close to home, and Harvard's close to home, and I've been following this issue for a while. So I want to talk about Harvard, not because I think Harvard is by itself such an important actor, but I think Harvard can tell us about what universities are doing and can do, and also because I think Harvard is a privileged actor in the sense of people take us really seriously, and we can set agendas for other actors. So this is Harvard's sustainability principles. We've had a sustainability plan since 2014. We have a new presidential committee on sustainability. And that committee has set very ambitious goals for us, including a goal that we should be carbon fuel neutral by 2026 and carbon fossil fuel free by 2050. Okay, so that's a very ambitious agenda. And we've made, here at Harvard, good progress in looking at things like recycling and like buildings emissions. But we have, what the committee has said, we have new challenges, we have new frontiers, and those frontiers are food, travel, investment. when I have a colleague at the Kennedy School, Bill Clark. He's on the Harvard, he's on one of these Harvard committees on sustainability. He came to talk to the Kennedy School faculty, and he said, we've got new frontiers, folks. We've got food, travel, investment. And then he said, and I know telling Harvard faculty that you might try to take away their travel is like telling gun owners that you're going to take away their guns. And everyone laughed, and he was right, okay? So first thing I clarify, I'm not here to take away your travel, nor is the plan to do that. But there is a plan to start to think, so here, there's a plan to start thinking about travel. But before I get there, let me talk about, we said food, investment, travel. Okay, let's talk about investment. That's what most people are talking about on campus right now. And there is university divestment's a big issue. 150 universities around the world have divested, about 50 of those in the United States. And some of them are institutions that Harvard would consider peer institutions, okay? Most of those are doing partial divestment, coal and tar sands. So that's Stanford, Columbia, that list you have over here. But some are doing full divestment. And just recently, the University of California system in its entirety announced full divestment from fossil fuels, okay? And announced it with confidence that they didn't think it was going to affect their financial situation. As you know, this is something that's not happening at Harvard yet, that Harvard has not said that we're willing to divest. And I just want to say, I think this is something, we see from these universities that are already doing it, this is something that universities can and should do. And I believe that Harvard should divest. I think we should start with coal and sand tar, and I think we should move to full divestment. Having said that, I don't think divestment should be the only discussion in the room. And too often at a university, divestment is the only discussion. As if we're not divesting, why should anybody do anything else? Okay? There's reason to believe that this travel issue I want to talk about is as important, if not more important, than divestment, but people don't want to talk about it. Okay? Because, it's a good question. Why is that? I think divestment's easy. It's something that those folks at the top, at the financial offices of the university have to do, but that doesn't affect us. Right? Where travel starts being what affects us too. But so at the Kennedy School, we're starting to do research. We're finding this, for example, that we worked really hard on our remodel building at the Kennedy School. We have solar panels and all sorts of cool stuff. And we got a LEED Platinum Award. Is that right, Dan? Did I have the word right? Okay. But then we started looking at our travel, and we found that faculty travel and travel of guests that we invite to the Kennedy School dwarfs of what we've done with our building. And so if we don't come to grips with travel, we're going to have trouble coming to grips with other issues. Now, so we've started to collect data about it, and we've started to suggest we should have a voluntary pledge program by faculty, okay? And that the voluntary pledge should look like something like saying, I pledge, which is what I personally have done, to try to give up one international trip a year. Now, I've got some slides here later to show you why it is that I think one international trip is so important. Those slides suggest that the most impactful thing we can do is go car-free in terms of our individual consumption. The second most impactful thing we can do is cancel one transatlantic plane trip. And then later on we can do a plant-free diet. It's a little bit down below. So you got give up a car, cancel one transatlantic plane trip, or go have a plant-based diet in that order. And it means that travel is way more important than most of us think. And it's like go car free. It doesn't say go airplane free. It says give up one trip, right? So we're working on this pledge program right now. Now, I want to include a slide here from on offsets, but I want to call out the people who actually did this slide, because two of my students are in the room with my global governance class, and they were part of a task force on offsets. We asked them to do a task force to what the Kennedy School should do on offsets. So it says Dan and Yuki here, and I'm using your slide without your permission, but I knew you were going to be here, so I hoped you would agree that as long as I attribute. So carbon offsets, they had a whole nice set of slides, so I just gave you one here. But they're recommending that the Harvard Kennedy School could use offsets, not as a substitute for our reduction in travel, but as a complement to our reduction in travel. That when we can't reduce our travel, that we consider offsetting our travel. And they recommended a certification organization called Gold Standard, that's already checking out these different offset organizations. There's a lot of problems with offsets. There's a lot of people claiming to do offsets that aren't doing a good job and that may be not fully truthful. And so we have certifying organizations that are certifying offset programs, and you can work with Gold Standard to know that you're choosing a certifiable offset program. Okay, so transportation decisions. People go, why transportation decisions? But the U.S. economy in 2016, emissions from transportation surpassed those from electricity generation. So once again, we think it's all in electricity generation or fossil fuel companies, but it turns out it's a lot about individual choices about transportation. And cars and trucks make up most of this choice, but for people at places like Harvard, flying makes up a lot of it. So transportation decisions are a very important part of the agenda here in the U.S. and elsewhere. This is the chart I mentioned earlier. This is a study. Wines and Nicholas are doing kind of a macro analysis. They're actually surveying about 30 to 40 articles that involve 140 scenarios to try to say what is the most impactful way that you can make individual actions around climate. And the first one here, I don't know if you can read this very well, is have one fewer child. And that's been a very controversial part of this study because it's called, people are saying it's a category error, right? It's like, do my emissions get charged to my mom and dad? And then my kids' emissions get charged to me? And it's complicated how we do that. And so I'm going to just set that aside, though most people working on climate change do believe that children and education for women, for example, and girls, is an important part of climate change policy. But the next one, as I said, is live car-free, avoid one transatlantic flight, then buy green energy, buy a more efficient car, switch electric car to car-free, and then the last green is the plant-based diet. All the greens here are high impact. Those are high impact choices, kind of in order of their impact. The blue is moderate impact, and the yellow is low impact. And what you see is we often spend too much time on the low impact or the moderate impact and not enough time on the high impact, okay? Which is not saying you shouldn't recycle. You should, people should recycle. I'm not going to stop recycling just because it's listed as moderate impact. But you shouldn't sort of pat yourself on the back because you're recycling and think you've done all that you can do. So we have some guidance about what works and what's impactful. And I think it's not enough just to take responsibility. It's important to think about effective responsibility. And in the book, I actually return to Max Weber and his article, Politics as Vocation. And Max Weber has a very interesting argument about responsibility and what he calls an ethic of responsibility. He contrasts an ethic of responsibility with an ethic of intention. He says the ethic of intention is you want to have people who just want to have the pure flame of their intention apparent to all, but they're not concerned about whether it actually works. Okay, an ethic of responsibility makes you think about consequences. Are the choices I'm making actually going to lead to the outcome I'm seeking? And so this book not only argues in favor of responsibility, but it argues in favor of an ethic of responsibility, a Weberian ethic of responsibility, to think about effectiveness. And to think about effectiveness, we get to engage social science, which I think is something that we scholars can make a contribution, saying there is social science about what works. Okay, conclusions. So these are some more photos from that I took at the climate strike. A couple things I like about this. One is I like that the students are also reminding us that if you want to take responsibility for climate change, you need to take responsibility to vote also. And that fits nicely with me because the central chapters of this book are about responsibility to vote, and they're actually about student voting. And they're about student voting at Harvard. And and I again use Harvard because it's close to home, but it's a really good study of how you can move from no norm entrepreneurs to norm entrepreneurs and what difference it makes. Okay, so students voted the lowest number of any group in this country. In the 2014 elections, Harvard students, 22% of 2014 midterm elections, 22% of eligible Harvard students voted. Okay, and after 2014. There are a series of things began to happen on campus. We're very proud of the Kennedy School. Some of our students invented something called Turbo Vote, which is the biggest platform now for people to be able to handle voting registration online. Okay? But then the university decided to incorporate Turbo Vote into its voter registration efforts. And eventually the university decided, with a lot of pressure from students, that when you register for classes at Harvard, you get bumped at the college and at the Kennedy School, but not everywhere else, you get bumped into a voter registration pane. So you register for classes, and then it says, do you want to register to vote? And you click yes, and it pops you into Turbo Vote. Okay? Now, that apparently, that reform, plus the student activism, increased our voting in the next election by 9%, went up 9%. We just got the data in for 2018 midterms. And by the way, this is really good data. This is not exit poll data. This is working with NSOLV, which is a voting group at Tufts. And this is actual. Harvard signs a deal. 1,000 universities have signed deals with Tufts, NSOLV. And our actual voting data, cleaned of any identifying things, gets crossed with national data every place in the country. So it's not just our students who are in Massachusetts. It's our students wherever they vote. Okay? In 2018, 48% of Harvard eligible students voted. In other words, we more than doubled between the two midterm elections. And in 2018, we matched, in a midterm, we matched the student voting level in the 2012 presidential elections. What it showed was that this kind of organizing activism could produce dramatic change. Okay, and we know something about what increases student voting. Campus climate is very important, and we know that faculty and administrators can make a big difference for campus climate, as do students. And so I'm happy to admit that we political scientists came really late to this, and I know those political scientists are saying we came late to this issue, but luckily I think people are on board now and realizing that talking about responsibility to vote is something that we do in political science classes. And telling people how to vote, not who to vote for, how to vote, is part of political science. And so I did focus groups with Harvard undergrads in spring of 2018. And people really said it is so, it's hard to vote. It's confusing to vote. We don't always have information about how to do it. And not only that, we're busy. We have problem sets to do. We've got lots of other stuff. Maybe we're too busy to vote. And anyway, where do you find stamps? It turns out the stamps, I'm sure I have some millennials in the thing, but stamps are a big issue for absentee voting, right? And so I'm doing this focus group, and I'm like saying, you guys are some of the smartest young people in the country. If you can't figure out to vote, if you can figure out how to get to Harvard, you can figure out how to vote. And then I realized everyone helps them get into Harvard. Their high school teachers, their high school counselors, their families, all the neighbors, the tutors that their families hire for them, etc. And you know what? No one helps them vote. We're not helping young people in our society vote. Young people don't help one another. Neighbors don't ask. They ask, if you got into Yale, they don't ask, are you registered to vote? And so it's a cultural change that needs to happen of people saying, no, we're responsibility to vote and responsibility to help others vote, especially young people who are challenged because they're mobile. And voting suppression in this country, in some states, is a conscious policy, and voter encouragement has to be no less conscious. So the one issue I want to end on, because I know you're going to ask this, so I want to get us started on this discussion. You will say, but how can individual efforts make any difference, right? How can they make any difference? How can, and the answer is, of course, that norm entrepreneurs do not intend to just stick with their individual actions. Norm entrepreneurs start with their individual actions in order to build a collective action and in order to build change. And that's this bottom-up movement towards change that is the pattern of how change happens, right? But they, at the same time, most of these norm entrepreneurs always connect personal action to their collective action and to their collective goals. Okay, so like the anti-slavery activists I talked about at the beginning, they, of course, always either did not have slaves or freed their slaves, of course. But they also did things like they didn't wear cotton, because cotton was produced by slavery, of course. My favorite was remember the foot binding activists I told you about? The foot binding activists formed anti-foot binding societies where they agreed to not bind the feet of their daughters and only marry their sons to women with unbound feet. Because they realized that as long as you had to bind your feet in order to get married, you would no longer, you couldn't stop the practice. You couldn't stop the practice. And so climate change has that decentralized quality to it. And that is, there's a lot that needs to be done, personal action, that activists need to take as part of an effort to build a collective movement. Okay. There's some fear that people call it crowding out. They say if you do one thing, you won't do the other. If you're worried about recycling, you obviously won't lobby your government to change its climate policies, So there's not good evidence on the crowding out hypothesis. Many people raise the crowding out hypothesis. I have not seen good evidence for it with regard to movement politics, okay? But there's an alternative hypothesis, which is my hypothesis, that people who do more, take individual action, who do more to learn about how to make personal change, are more effective in bringing about collective change. They ask better questions, they are better lobbyists when they talk to their government leaders, or they're more persuasive when they meet with their friends and colleagues. And so I'm gonna put out that hypothesis, we can talk about it during the Q&A period, that there's not like or personal or political structural change, but that these are two parts, two sides of one coin. So I want to end on that note. I want to point to, again, I love this, this slide. There is hope. I think it's important to end in this age of climate despair or even climate grief. Just this last weekend, 2 articles, one in the Boston Globe and one in the New York Times, about climate despair, climate grief that people are experiencing. And so this kind of action is also, I think, important for climate despair and grief. So in order, though, to enact hope, we have to take concerted effort, all of us connected to the problem of climate change and able to act, need to step forward and act. Thank you. I'm sorry, I'm a little longer, but we did have a shaky start. So I couldn't really time myself.
And if we're going to do questions, if people could move to the mics for the filming purposes, they wouldn't supply the handheld mic. There's a shortage of empty out there. So we had to go to the stick.
Or I would repeat questions if you want me to. If people can't or don't want to get up, I'm also happy to repeat your question.
And also, could you stand behind the podium to pick up the mic there?
Yeah. Except I myself am already breaking the rules. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Questions, comments? Christine, I see your hand, I could see it going up. Yes. Okay.
Thank you. This was really an inspirational talk, both at the personal level and as a scholar. I agree with Melanie about the possibility of engaging in public interest as well as studying. So with that preface, I have to ask, is there a possibility, is there a need for a responsibility to protect on climate change? So this August, as we all watched in horror as the Amazon rainforest was burning, President Macron made a rather controversial statement about whether there was an international obligation sometimes to intervene, to protect a common heritage if a country was engaging in irresponsible actions over a world resource. And so as the leading scholar of human rights who has studied the evolution of the responsibility to protect against humanitarian atrocities, what are your thoughts about the risks and promise of moving forward international law to think of a responsibility for such circumstances, and what conditions should we take for intervening?
Right. So first, thanks for the great question. For people in the room who may be less familiar, responsibility to protect is a doctrine. It has 3 pillars. It's soft law, not hard law. And the 3 pillars are, first, that a government has responsibility to protect its own citizens. Second, if a government fails in its responsibility or is having trouble meeting its responsibility to protecting its own citizens, other members of the international community should step forward and figure out how to help that government meet its obligations to protecting its own citizens. And the third pillar is, if, despite all your efforts to help a government protect its own citizens, it continues to abuse the rights of its citizens, that in a last instance, the UN Security Council could vote to intervene, to use a coercive diplomacy, use Chapter 7 of the UN Charter to intervene to protect the citizens. Okay, so I actually have written about this in my book Evidence for Hope, because most people misunderstand R2P. They think it means unilateral military intervention to protect human rights, and nowhere is that written in the actual doctrine. So it's actually been misinterpreted, and as a result, R2P has lost influence. If you've seen the chart, kind of norm charting stuff, you'll see R2P is declining in influence because people perceive it as being about unilateral military, I think, because people perceive it as being about unilateral military intervention, and they don't support that often. Okay, so and my position as a human rights scholar on R2P is it's almost never improves human rights. Military invasion almost never improves human rights. Why is that? Because in the biggest correlation, when you look at the causes of repression, the single biggest correlation in all of these regressions is between war, especially civil war, but also international war, and core human rights violations. In other words, war is the biggest cause of human rights violations. It's very tricky to use it as a cure for human rights violations, and I think often it should not be seen as something that's going to work to actually improve things. Having said that, I like the doctrine of R2P because it reframes sovereignty as responsibility. And sometimes reading sovereignty means, it's no one else's business what happens in a country. And I think reframing sovereignty as responsibility, that if you're sovereign, you have responsibility for your citizens, is a really important move. And so I think thinking about R2P, and especially pillars 1 and 2 more, around climate change would make sense. And even maybe thinking about empowering the Security Council, for example, to think about a grave climate change crisis might be a threat to international peace and security. The Security Council has changed its understanding of what constitutes a threat to international peace and security, and they could choose to do so as well with regard to a climate crisis. Yeah.
Have you studied the results in, say, New Zealand, where a river is now treated as a person? Does that reflect your own, what you were trying to articulate here in terms of the process of change?
Okay, so the question is, have I studied the situation like in New Zealand, or as I said, India with the Ganges River, where a river is granted rights? Does that change things? Okay, and no, I haven't studied it closely. Okay, but my somewhat more distant notion is that just giving a river rights is only a starting place. And it would work in the context of human mobilization of the kind we've been talking about in this talk, right? So giving a river rights is just a way to be able to litigate somewhat differently, right? But that litigation may not succeed, or that litigation may not be able to be enforced if there's not also the belief in human responsibilities to make sure that that litigation is enforced. So I would say it doesn't run contrary to the argument I'm making that we still have to turn to rights and responsibilities and not just rights. Sometimes I say the most important part of the title of the book is the and. No, because seriously, I promised you how it'll be interpreted, that somehow I'm backing away from rights and I'm talking only about responsibilities. And so I want to stress here that it's about rights and responsibilities. Yes?
I'm wondering, how do the U.S. civil society and the third sector, how do they change the strategy
Yeah.
after the Trump administration?
Okay, so Sarah is frowning at me. She really does want me to ask you to talk on the mic. So the people listening to this will want to hear your voice, not in your question.
Hi, I'm just wondering, how do the civil society, the third sector here in the U.S. change their strategy of activism after the Trump administration, and how do they interpret rights and responsibility differently now versus before? I don't know if you research into this area.
Well,
Thank you.
for example, with regard to responsibility to vote, I think there's no doubt that the Trump administration has been one factor that has contributed to a changing perception of responsibility to vote. Okay, in the sense that many young people thought they had a right to vote. Many people in this country, not just young people, thought they had a right to vote and a right not to vote, and that one could participate in many different ways. And if you didn't want to vote, you could participate in other ways. And I think really didn't take seriously either their right to vote and certainly not their responsibility to vote. And so there is this reframing. We got to get away from thinking I have a right to vote and a right not to vote. You actually don't have a right not to vote. Okay, this is a little controversial, okay? You have a choice not to vote for which you will not be penalized, okay? But there's no evidence in our Constitution or elsewhere that you have a right not to vote. And in fact, the other great duties of citizenship, right, which would be jury duty, paying taxes, and military service, or now it's no longer service, it's registration for selective service. All of those, you don't have a right not to do them. Try having a right not to pay taxes, right? And so we have these civic duties. 3 of them you can be penalized with fines or even prison by not performing them. It doesn't make sense that we'd have that fourth, a right to vote, and we'd also have a right not to vote. So I think it's important to say you have a choice not to vote. You don't have a right not to vote. And you have a responsibility to vote. So that, I think, has changed under Trump. Whether the organizing of the climate movement has changed, I'm sure there's got some people in the room here who may have ideas about that, and maybe I'll invite you to if anyone has an idea about answering that question, maybe you can go to the mic and share your beliefs. And I'm looking at Dan here because I think he might answer. But so, you know, what I can tell you is that I think it's more the sense of urgency that's changed things. I think a number of years ago people would have gone, you know, we have to keep the focus on the state. If you focus on individual responsibility, it's letting the state off the hook. You know, we can't let the state off the hook. This is a structural problem. We can't let corporations off the hook. We're not going to talk about anything else. Just states, corporations, period. And I think the great, great urgency that we perceive in climate change today has led us to say everything's got to be in play. And individual responsibilities of all non-state actors have to be part of the solution. Okay, and so all I can say is climate change is, people permit me to go further talking about responsibility on this issue than they will on any other human rights issue. Yeah, Michael, you're good. Okay.
So I have a question I'm struggling with on divestment. And so I'm actually, for example, I'm on the board of a public company. I'm the head of the governance committee. And the if someone, there are some shareholder groups that say that to the governance committee, if you're the chair and you don't have at least one woman on the board, we're going to vote against you as the chair and get you off the board, which is very powerful. Mm-hmm. If someone says, you don't have any women on the board, you only have one woman on the board, we're just going to sell our shares, then it doesn't do much for me. So they divest. They feel good, but it hasn't changed my behavior. Mm-hmm. So similarly, I wonder, I struggle with this. Is it better to divest from fossil fuel companies or form a consortium of universities and demand that, you know, you're going to monitor methane emissions and you're going to improve them by 30%, or we're going to vote the whole board out? Mm-hmm. You know, so I'm struggling with whether divestment really does anything other than make the people feel good, and then somebody else owns the shares, and the governance of the company is like, I don't care who owns them, I'm still here. You know? Yeah. That's my question.
By the way, Michael, the chair of the Carr Center for Human Rights Advisory Board. So that's a really good question. And I think the issue has to do with how we think about effectiveness. You know, so if the point is that our ethic or responsibility has to say, I want to change the behavior of that firm, then your recommendation of staying in is probably the better one. But if what we want to do is we want to shift the legitimacy of the fossil fuel industry entirely, then I think that the divestment move is more a move about symbolic gestures of changing perceptions of legitimacy. That's what happened in the tobacco industry, okay? In the tobacco industry, it just became a pariah industry. The fossil fuel industry is not at all that, but I think that when we see what we need to do in order to meet the minimum needed to increase 2 degrees Celsius, I think we've got to have a massive change in the way we think about the fossil fuel industry, and that's, I think, where divestment comes in. Yes. Yeah.
Great. Well, I'm going to jump into the mic here. Really, thank you so much for this. It's fascinating and inspirational despite climate despair. So I wonder if you opened by saying you're not going to talk about American policy around this issue, and I think that's well justified because we know the story in broad terms, even if we don't know the micro details. But I wonder if you could connect everything you've said to the national and the global levels of governance, and how, so you've outlined a lot of ways that individuals can mobilize as individuals and as members of organizations in potentially quite effective ways that have quantifiable impacts. Mm-hmm. What about the relationship between this individual and organizational subnational mobilization with global governance? Mm-hmm. So let's say the US is out of the picture for at least the next couple of years, if not longer, on these issues. Can this kind of more micro-level organizing have an impact on the global governance stage? And how do you connect the sort of collective mobilization of this more micro-level form of organization to other sites of lobbying or advocacy if the sort of the U.S. as an important global actor is either out of the picture or actively countering collective efforts to address this problem.
Right. So I thought you. Okay, so in the human rights area, one way that people have approached this is saying when our government won't ratify a treaty, that non-state actors will say that they're going to ratify a treaty and they will start trying to comply with it. So, for example, CEDAW, which is the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the Women's Human Rights Convention, the United States has not ratified, even though we mainly we've done a lot to comply with that treaty, but we haven't ratified it. But, for example, the city of San Francisco has said, we want to ratify CEDAW. Now, it's a symbolic gesture. They can't do it. But if enough subnational units stepped up and said, what would it take for us to comply with U.S. commitments under Paris, that'd be really interesting. California is trying to do it, as you know. And so what it means is that states may need to do climate change foreign policy, okay? And cities may need to do their part for climate change foreign policy. Cambridge, by the way, you know, did you see the third one there? It's clean energy. Cambridge gives us a clean energy option, which I have chosen, and I get a little message in the mail every month telling me, you know, what I'm doing. But so cities can do this clean energy issue that can be really important, can be very impactful. So that my thing would say is I think all these both corporations themselves can do things for climate change. I don't think fossil fuel companies, you know, I think the whole business model are not going to, but I think there's a lot of other corporations that could step forward and could be very good corporate citizens around climate change. Not only that, the one big corporate issue, and Mike, you may, is hiring great staff, right? And young people that care about this issue. You want to attract and retain the best young talent. Corporations should be putting a climate change policy right at the top of their agenda, because that's going to help them recruit and retain the best young staff people, okay? So I think if all of these non-state actors and subnational units start thinking of themselves as saying, while our government won't have a climate change foreign policy and has withdrawn from Paris, let's suppose under Paris, what would we need to do our share to help the U.S. meet its goal under Paris? We have that goal, you know? And so we could break it down. We could break it down to what every unit needs to do to meet Paris, and we should start doing that. So when we have a return to Paris, which I think we will have, then we could have well underway a planning process thought out about what each piece of the United States would have to do to meet it. Okay, something that has not been happening, you know. So that's what I would suggest. But Bruce, yeah.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed the presentation. And this is kind of a technical question. I don't know if you have the details with you, but I'm really struck by this thing about taking one fewer flight and conserving energy. And the reason I ask is because I think most other things up there, very, very believable that's action we can take and we can reduce our carbon footprint. But I have really trouble understanding the flight aspects of it and what the math was that went into calculating if you don't take one flight, we get so much credit. Because, okay, I was going to fly to, let's say I was going to fly to Honduras. Well, instead of flying to Honduras, I'll cancel that flight, but I'm going to drive to New York. And, you know, it's not like the world will come to a standstill. And it would seem to me that the pressure has to be on the airlines, just like it is on the auto industry. The pressure has to be on the airlines to come up with electric airplanes or some more efficient mode of air travel. I'm just trying to understand. I'd like to get behind it, but I can't. Yeah. And so what's the detail or a little bit of the math that would make it more convincing? Okay, so first, one thing, I'm not the math person who's going to do it for. What I can tell you is that I've been doing my carbon footprint for many years on many different carbon footprint calculators. I used to do it for a class I taught. And all of us in the class did carbon footprints, and I did mine. And the students put theirs up, and they all looked pretty good, because student footprints are pretty good. And then I put mine up, and it looked really bad.
And I could watch my footprint as I plugged in my data, you know, my data about my heating, about my car, my driving, about, you know, whatever. And then I would start putting in my flights, and you could just see it, poosh. It was very clear to me from, 15 years ago that I personally, given my lifestyle, could not address climate change, so without addressing air travel. Okay. Now, different people are different ways. Many people in this country don't fly that much. Obviously, they've got other issues. So I'm speaking to a community that we live in, and I promise you, do your carbon footprint on any of these trackers, and who are using different math and have slightly different models behind them. Okay, so it's not just one math model. There's lots of math models, and you're going to find that for most people living our kind of life. Now, you're talking a substitution effect. So the plan is, I would take a drive to New York instead. The plan is you reduce one flight and you replace it with a Zoom or a Zoom or Skype lecture. You don't, but it's also okay to say, like, I just went to Princeton the other day, I took the train, right? Because we have charts as well that tell us, and the train the emissions are much lower. So if I have to go to Princeton, I have an option there with a train that's going to have fewer emissions, okay? But ideally, the proposal is to stay home and to do it video. Okay, now, the issue I'm also making, I know what I'm going to do. I'm trying to do, I think there's a win-win here at Harvard, because guess what? Like, if we stay home, we might talk to our own colleagues more. We might talk to our students more. In other words, I think our quality of life is insane, and that we would improve not only diminish our carbon footprint, but improve our quality of life by decreasing our number of trips. But that you still want a more technical. So keep going.
Again, it's just the matter of what does it take for one person not taking one flight to have an effect, because in my mind, and I think in most people's minds, that flight still goes.
Yeah, of course.
And so how have you come up with these, and I understand you could take the emissions of a plane, divide by the number of people on that plane, and come up with a emission per person or something like that, and use that in your calculator. But when you're trying to change a culture, it has to be something that can be understood. And I'm really having a hard time seeing how did you get to that number. And I accept all these other beneficial effects of not flying, but it's just very difficult for me to understand how you communicate that to the population at large. Thank you. There's other people here to ask questions.
It's a great question. Obviously, in the short term, the plane leaves. So yes, this model depends on supply and demand. It's a supply and demand model. In other words, it's not a radical thing. It's a basic economic supply and demand. The plane leaves, but there's a point where if one more person doesn't get on the plane, they cancel it, okay? And so, yes, shows how individual action has to coalesce into large enough collective action that planes, there's not as much demand for air travel, and eventually the flights get canceled. I don't think that's math. I think that's an economic model that's well accepted. There is supply and demand in this area. Okay.
Hi,
People should be identify themselves. I know some of you, but yeah.
I'm Carly Bariant. I'm a doctoral student here, and I study the legacy of nuclear testing in American empire and climate change in the Marshall Islands.
Wow.
And I really appreciate your talk here today. I think it raises some wonderful questions about territorial sovereignty and what happens to small island nation states if indeed they go underwater. The two questions that I would love to hear your thoughts on are about reparations around climate change and what this framework says to the people living in small island nation states about their ethical responsibilities. I noticed one of the charts you gave said that 70+% people think that those living in developing nations have a significant role to play in this. And so I was wondering if you could tell us more about what you see as that role. Thanks.
Right. So one reason I use the Iris Young's parameters and talk about power and privilege is obviously I do think that more powerful and privileged actors have unique sets of responsibilities. Okay, but But as an IR scholar, I think that Kyoto failed. We know Kyoto failed, okay? And it failed in part because it didn't distinguish between small island states, really poor countries, and the emerging economies. And a solution that left China and India out was going nowhere, okay? And so I do think when we start thinking about we need to really distinguish between categories of developing countries and realize that any solution that doesn't involve these large emerging economies is destined to failure. Okay. So reparations for climate change. I think right now we're in mitigation, then we're going to talk about adaptation, and then we're going to talk about these, new schemes of shooting particles into the air to stop climate change. Geoengineering, right? But right now I'm talking mitigation, and we're falling so short of mitigation that, we're going to be arriving way too soon at the adaptation area, in which case we're going to talk seriously about reparations, some kind of not just reparations, remedies more, and just where are people going to go, where are they going to live. But I am not willing to give up on mitigation yet, put it that way. And I think it's I've got colleagues at the Kennedy School, it's like all, it's geoengineering, we're already there. That's what we're going to talk about. And I feel like there's still is a moment here for serious action on mitigation that I would like to have us concentrate on. And right now in this country, that's where we want to put. I mean, we can't even get mitigation. We can't. There's so little we can do right now that to even that we're not in a reparations place yet. I think ethically reparations are needed. Politically, we can't get mitigation, which is I believe our first responsibility.
Hi, I'm Eve. I'm an undergraduate associate at the Weatherhead Center, and I really liked your point about the way that people tend to bristle at this idea of responsibility, especially in the context of climate change, and with the way you linked it to this liability model. But I was just wondering about this maybe additional piece about kind of once you add climate change to people's consciences, it feels like there's no end, or it's hard to know when enough is enough. And so I was just wondering kind of how you would suggest that people grapple with this question of, it seems like at every moment in their lifestyle choices it comes up, and so kind of how to handle that without having it be overwhelming.
I mean, that's one reason why I popped up this slide, okay, because I do think that there are some people for whom who are already doing a lot about responsibility, and then they just feel completely overwhelmed and not even knowing where to start, how to make choices, what to do, what not to do. And we're all like rushing out and putting our clothes on the, drying our clothes, But so, here it is, hang dry clothes. Okay, so if I had to make choices, I'm not going to run out and hang my wet clothes, hang clothes to dry, because given my lifestyle, I need to be up here. I got to be up here, and I think I particularly need to be on that airplane place. Okay, so I do think that I think people should think about the ethic, responsibility, the effectiveness. And that doesn't mean they, should stop. I'm not advising people to stop recycling, for example. I've reached the point where I can't put a glass bottle in the garbage. It just gives me the creeps. But I do think we should base on given who we are and what our what our footprint is, where can we be most effective? And one thing, I didn't say this because it can be off-putting people, but Iris Young says that ethical and political responsibilities are discretionary. And what she means by that is exactly what you said. There's too many responsibilities in the world. We can't all do everything. And if we think about all our responsibilities all the time, we almost are immobilized by it. And so we can be discretionary. We can choose what's more effective, but also what do I care more about, what do I know more about, where do I feel most comfortable making a contribution. And the issue is not, am I doing everything? The issue is, am I doing something? Am I doing more? Yes.
Hi, I'm a graduate student associate in the doctoral program in government. I study adaptation and solar geoengineering. So this is it's interesting.
Okay, so but let me ask you a question. Do you think we should give up on mitigation?
No, I mean I don't think we should give up on mitigation. I mean I worry, I guess, about a lot of this stuff in terms of whether it's going to happen. And my question is kind of related to that. So one of the big challenges, and this links to some of the past questions as well, is the attribution both of historical responsibility and current responsibility. So on the topic of airlines, EasyJet has recently been unveiling a campaign where, they're going to purchase offsets, and they're, as are a lot of other airlines. I think the Financial Times had found that it covers a fraction of their emissions. I mean, air travel technology is not has lagged way behind. And similarly, I mean, you saw this in the failure of the Kyoto Accord, that a lot of these purchasing of offsets and a lot of things that people were saying were helping the environment weren't. So how does that affect, to be provocative, the usefulness of the framework of responsibilities when it seems to also have led actors to, not be fully transparent about what they're doing or the effectiveness of it, or to lie about that?
Yeah. So again, it may help coming from the human rights realm, someone who does research in human rights, right? And we know states ratify treaties, and then we know there's massive noncompliance, and there's hypocrisy. And in fact, norms theorists build hypocrisy into the model. So hypocrisy, the difference, is what like an activist, they like hypocrisy, because that's the tool you use to then start pushing harder, right, to get these hypocrites who said they're trying to do something, but we know they're not really doing it, to try to improve their practices. Okay, so I think anyone who studies kind of norm change realizes that if you think you set a model and then you get 100% compliance, it just doesn't work that way. But that people stating that they're committed to something can be a tool for what I used to call the in Activists Beyond Borders, we talked about accountability politics and leverage politics. And accountability politics is using what EasyJet says and then pushing them to really do something meaningful that way. But obviously, there's if hypocrisy goes on for too long, then it's corrosive. And so the offset issue has been, and this is why I really liked what my task force did, and maybe Daniel or Yuki want to say something about it, but there's a lot of critiques of the offset, and there's a lot of lousy offsets out there, but there's 4 certification schemes now for offsets. So we have certifying bodies, and we can ask, and anyone says, I offset, you say, who are you using to certify that these are legitimate offsets? And so that's global. We have global governance of offsets now, and like most global governance, it was moving from a very informal kind of thing to a more formal, more rule-bound, and more metrics to use. So we need to use those metrics to try to hold these actors accountable.
What about the responsibility historically, or the responsibility associated with a certain disaster? I mean, it's hard, geophysically, to actually identify whether this was the cause of climate change, like an individual event versus, a trend. So, sorry.
No, I'm just saying, this is why I think right now that focusing too much on responsibility as liability, as who's to blame, is not going to be able to mobilize the kind of global movement that's required. Because then if you're not to blame, you say, I'm off the hook, right? And we're past that point. The horse is out of the barn, It's not enough to just have the people who are to blame. It doesn't mean you shouldn't blame them. I think you shouldn't ask for reparations or remedies. But I think that the too much emphasis on only backward-looking responsibility is not going to give the energy that we need to this movement. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Molly. I'm an undergrad here.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I have 2 questions. First of all, it might be hard to determine this mathematically for this chart, but where does generalized material consumption fall into this?
So, there are I just put up one because I thought it was pretty new and I thought pretty good study. There are many different studies that are doing this, and there's different rankings. There's not a single ranking. You know, there's the drawdown. Have you ever seen drawdown? Which is thinking not about individual, it's thinking more about more collective issues. But, you know, drawdown, its number one thing is like working on refrigerants, for example. But its number 3 thing is thinking about food waste. And you know, then there's this whole debate, right? FAO, I think, said if food waste were a country, it would be the 3rd largest emitter in the world. And then someone said, you can't say that. You can't say if food waste were a country. It's just an absurd thing to say. You know, but it still focuses the mind that one of the problems we have is just waste. And food waste is the first kind of waste and the most important, and something that, by the way, is another huge problem at Harvard. But then consumption waste in general, right? And so there's a book, an Inconvenient, is it called Inconspicuous Consumption? Tatiana Schlossberg just published a book, and she spends a lot of time on the fast fashion. Is that it? Fast fashion?
Yeah, fast
right?
fashion.
Fast fashion as being a big problem because it encourages, it has, instead, we used to have like 4 seasons, now they're like 20, Zara has like 26 seasons. You know, it encourages the, consumption, very rapid consumption and very rapid disposal of material goods. And so certainly, if that's, you know, I think we do need to think about waste and the production of waste across the board. But there are some areas like food where waste is particularly, you know, prominent. And I feel like the waste areas are kind of the win-win areas. You know, it's like, really, if we could fix, I mean, the Kennedy School, by the way, has a very casual thing, but it's working. Every time we have one of these receptions, you know, and there's piles of food left over, there's a network of people, of faculty assistants and graduate students. They send out an email. It's like, food's there, everyone's gone, come and get it. And the food disappears. And we're really happy because it means we're diminishing our food waste. There's no reason we couldn't have, and so there's even an organized system now because originally it was informal and they got worried that things would go bad. Right, so now there's like they set a certain time limit on it and they put a little sign that says, this is for you to take. So when you walk past the table and you feel embarrassed because, you know, it says, no, free food, take it. And so there are ways to kind of get better systems to avoid this. And like Schlossberg's book also points out that our whole notion of expiration dates for food in this country is completely informal. I thought it was like the Food and Drug Administration really knew that my olives were going to go bad on the 29th of December, you know. Turns out that it's almost completely fictional, okay? And so either we need to have like good standards, which maybe we can or maybe we can't, or we need, you know, I mean, we need to recognize, no, don't throw away something just because there's a bad date on it, you know. Use your own senses before you throw, you know, smell something. Yeah, exactly. So I know, so there are these systems, like we believe them like they're the God's truth, you know, expiration date that turns out to not really be a good guidance.
Can I ask a follow-up question that related to that? So climate change is so urgent and so pervasive, but there's so many other environmental issues that I think like there's a lot of focus on like energy, and someone said like, oh, the environmental issues is just like an engineering problem. We just have to like take the carbon out of the air. And I'm like, well, what about all the plastic in the ocean? What about the mercury? What about the soil degradation? There's like so many other environmental issues. So how can we ensure that our actions don't get fixated on climate change and don't get fixated on like carbon and just the way in which we interact with the earth more generally, like how to encourage that sort of larger cultural shift?
Yeah, I mean, you know, Young would say that's what she means by being discretionary, is that people do get to say, this is what most moves me. This is what gets me up in the morning. But I also think we should be thinking the kind of overlap win-win situations. There's things that are simultaneously good for climate change and good for some of the other environmental issues that you're concerned about. And you might sort of say, can I find that overlap there and work in particularly in that area that helps me address sort of 2 or 3 of my priorities? Yeah.
My question you just sort of touched on. I've was trying to better understand when we were talking about political responsibility being discretionary, and you could, if your skill is in getting the plastic out of the ocean, maybe you don't spend your time taking care of food waste. That seemed to slip into the risk of what you talked about earlier, of the ethics of intention. And how I can, value signal, I'm doing something here to do my part to save the world, and so I can excuse myself from doing something else elsewhere, and if you don't look too closely at the math, I can get away with a lot more than I deserve. And I think I'm just not understanding how you see that continuum. I'm hoping you can elaborate a little more on that.
Yeah. So, so when Weber talks of the ethics of intention, he has this really great quote. I won't be able to do it word for word, but he basically says, there are people who just want to be the flame of pure intention, right? And we have tried. I've been there, right? And we know people like that, right? It's not important what difference I make. It's important that I express my opposition, right, in a way that's most visible, that I'm most passionate about. I do not believe that Iris Young is saying that, but I can say that my contribution in some way is sort of adding Weber to Young, okay, which is funny because Weber way produced her, but I'm saying Young talks about discretion. I don't think she talks enough about effectiveness. And so by adding this ethic of Weber's ethic of responsibility, saying we need to think about that things can be discretionary, but that doesn't mean we're going to give up on effectiveness. We need to think about having discretion and wanting to be effective. And that's kind of the suggestion I was making. You have some discretion, but couldn't you figure out a way to be effective by working on two areas that you're passionate about that would include climate change? Right. So, and again, I feel sort of we are called as social scientists to this issue of effectiveness. There's actually a lot of good research out there, and so I sort of feel like we should be consulting the research. When we make a decision to move on some issue, we should be doing our best job of consulting the research and doing and thinking about what's the best thing that social science or science can tell us about what works. Mm-hmm.
I'm Fernando, and I'm an affiliate of a visiting scholar at Harvard. Mm-hmm. And my question is regarding the norm entrepreneurs. Mm-hmm. How do they appear? What's their role? And what's their potential in advocacy and change?
Right. Really great question, Fernando. It's good to see you here. Thanks for coming. So norm entrepreneurs, some of them are people who are victims, for example. So some of the norm entrepreneurs I have studied, in places like Argentina during the dictatorship, right, were people who didn't volunteer to be a norm entrepreneur. They lost a child. A child was disappeared, and they kind of stepped forward without any desire to be a norm entrepreneur and found themselves in that role, just trying to find their child, okay? But other norm entrepreneurs are brought to, I think it's a really interesting story, and the truth is every time I start working on a new issue, I go back and try to find the early norm entrepreneurs, and they're a quirky group, and there's no good explanation for them. Some are, like the thing that surprised me, of course, about abolition, most of the early abolitionists were brought by religion. Their religion, their particular religion, which was part of the Second Great Awakening, was kind of an evangelical movement in this country, brought them to an understanding of social sin. And they were driven to work on their religion drove them to work on against slavery, which was social sin. But it also drove them to work on prohibition. Slavery and the anti-slavery and prohibition activists were some of the same people. And alcohol was another social sin. Right? And so we forget that we remember the abolitionists. We forget that they were simultaneously believed in prohibition of alcohol, something that failed. So they did something that succeeded eventually, the abolition, and something that failed, prohibition. So there's lots of stories about what brings people to it. And I would ask some of the young people in the room, young people for various reasons, have really been brought to this issue. And I think it's partly on the signs on the climate strike, what gave this sense of, you'll be dead, we'll be alive, right? There was a sense of mortality, that this was affecting their mortality, which doesn't really fit with any real timeline of climate change. So in some ways, some of the young activists have squished the timeline to make it a sense of their own mortality. So I don't have a good explanation of what brings people to it. But some people discover that they have the temperament for it. And again, takes temperament. Heaven forbid, you don't want to really have to be one yourself or live with one, because a lot of normal entrepreneurs are very, very single-minded people and very difficult people to live with. So, but these young people, many of these young people are so the young people, the Friday, what's it called? Fridays for the Future people, the German parents are at their wits' ends. Their kids are skipping school every Friday. They're missing their exams. They're not going to get into college, And my feeling is these parents have to start bargaining with their kids who are being norm entrepreneurs. They have to say, okay, you go to school on Friday and I'll cancel a flight, so the world will be better off. That would be a way of expressing responsibility, instead of they're just saying, you have to go to school, you have to take your exams, you can't go in front of the Bundestag every Friday. That's not the way to help here. Some teachers are teaching classes right there in front of the Bundestag. I mean, some people are saying, okay, let's use climate change as a good example to study science, and I'll teach your class right there where you are. But I'm sorry, I'm digressing. The point being that there's no recipe for how to be a norm entrepreneur. Sorry. Luis.
Okay. I think what you're presenting is the issue, I think the audience is presenting is how to move from individual action to the collective action. No? When I had to go to London next week, I like to go to London, I will take my flight, and I agree with the person who say, okay, if I don't take my flight, the airplane will, in any case, will go. Mm-hmm. And you say, yes, will be a tipping point that the flight, no, but it's difficult. So the corrosive effect. So being a lawyer, I think I like to present one idea to you is, you're saying we don't need to see backward. But in fact, there is a combination between watching backward and then moving forward. Mm-hmm. And it's this idea, imagine you win a case in a court in New York against the company for emission of gases. Mm-hmm. That will trigger insurance problems. Mm-hmm. And insurance is a mechanism. You need one case, and in the global insurance approach, the company has to start to pay for that. If there's a case, there's a risk, and insurance is coming. Mm-hmm. So my feeling is we need to move, maybe the idea is to move, include incentives, not just individual moral, mm-hmm. and move from national state control to type of corporate control where insurance companies are providing the control. Mm-hmm. So that's a lawyer idea.
Great. So first, I believe that we shouldn't get rid of backward-looking accountability or liability. Okay, I think the problem is that sometimes 100% of our thinking is backward-looking. And so what I'm trying to argue is that we shift the percentage of thinking so that there's a little more forward thinking and a little less backward thinking. Okay, and so it's not saying you lawyers give up your lawsuits. I love some of these lawsuits, okay, but I'm saying that only gives us so far. We need to have more forward-looking accountability also. Okay, the one I want to talk about is incentives, not just morals. Okay, so there's two models of human behavior in the social sciences, right? One of them is people are motivated by incentives, and the other is people are motivated by norms. And this is the big debate between Kahneman and Tversky and between economists. And it's the reason why Kahneman and Tversky got the economic prize, right? Because they said, no, humans are completely irrational all the time. And they're not motivated mainly by incentives. They're actually motivated by what other people around them are doing, what's neat, what's cool, what's the thing to do, right? And so I think I've got a lot of behavioral economics and psychology behind me. I'm not just a moralist, okay? I'm saying people are social creatures. They want to do what everyone else is doing, right? And we need to make these things the norms, the appropriate things to do. We need to make them fun, cool. I mean, voting, I promise you, lecturing students about voting is not going to work. But making voting fun, making it you students who are here, you are planning already parties, right, for the next, the elections. You plan parties, you organize your friends to go with you to the voting booth. That's what does it, okay? So I want to be interpreted correctly. I'm not about morality. I'm about norm change. And with an understanding that humans are social creatures who conform to the norms of their society. I think you want me how am I doing? Last? Last.
Okay. Hi, my name's Keshav and I'm a PhD student from UMass. I'm kind of curious to know whether you think there needs to be something of a change in the voting mechanics, because I kind of was surprised that in the US you don't actually have a public holiday for election day. In a lot of countries, like India included, you actually have a public holiday on election day. So if you don't go to vote, there is literally no excuse at all. Mm-hmm. And pretty much you know what hours a polling station has. If you're registered, pretty much you need to go there and do it, and if you don't vote, it's pretty much like a case of shame on you. But over here, I realize a lot of people, especially people in marginal jobs, who are genuinely afraid of going and skipping a shift to vote because they'll end up getting fired, or people who are simply too swamped with their work and their lives to actually go ahead and vote. So I'm just curious to know what you would think about something like that.
Yeah, I'm on record on Twitter calling for a national holiday called Democracy Day. Right, and I'm on record actually recommending that in Massachusetts we cancel Columbus Day and instead have Democracy Day on Election Day. So I completely agree with you. We need a holiday. Most other countries do. It would be a good thing. But the reason to do it is not just make it practical, but to celebrate our elections and make voting a thing that's fun and interesting. Yeah.
I just had one quick point. As someone who organizes academic conferences at Harvard, and we're talking about changing norms, I can tell you that I book hundreds of flights and order thousands of dollars of food to be delivered in. And I think that we could, as a whole, change our norm on how we run academic conferences if we're looking at flights. I mean, it could all be done, electronically and via Zoom. So it's something to think about on our norms. And
put it this way, this is a thing where Harvard students, staff, and faculty and administrators all have a super important role to play. And now, I don't think we're going to replace, in-person stuff. There's something about in-person contact, which all of us realize permits certain kinds of exchanges, but we could do a lot more with video conference. So Bill Clark gave the example. He goes, I got invited to a one-day conference on climate change in Singapore. This is the absurdity of it. No, you're flying people from all over the world for one day in Singapore to talk about climate change. And he goes, no, he says, I'll do my presentation by Zoom. And they said, oh, well, that'll be at 2 a.m. And he said, let's get this straight. You want me to fly 24 hours? Or I get up at 1 a.m. and talk to you at 2. I'll choose that. So yes, so we need to think together. And the food waste thing, I think there's a huge, I think there's a, how can I say?
Harvard could arguably just feed everyone here without us all having to go out and order out, right? It could support a farm to feed everyone. I mean, really, the amount of money that each center, each seminar, each group pays to have lunch brought in or dinner brought in, I mean, you could sustainably do it, anyway.
There's room for lots of creative thinking, and don't get me started on sugar, which is my another thing. So. No cookies. No more ordering cookies. I want to thank you for these are terrific, terrific questions and comments. I really appreciate your thoughts and your comments. So thank you very much. And there are cookies, right?